Welcome to a deep dive into totalitarianism.
Okay.
And to really get into it, we're focusing on Stalin's Russia,
Right.
1928 to 1953. We've got a lot of really fascinating source material for this one. We've got some dense academic notes to try to sift through.
Yeah.
We've got some historical images, even some propaganda posters,
Well,
the kind that really give you a glimpse into how a regime wants to shape people's perceptions.
yeah, it's amazing how those primary sources can really transport you back in time.
Yeah,
And I think by analyzing them, we can answer questions you might not even know you had about this period.
right.
Like what was daily life actually like under Stalin? How did he amass so much power and hold on to it for so long?
Mm.
And what were the true consequences of his policies?
Yeah, because let's be honest, Stalin's reign wasn't exactly sunshine and rainbows.
No.
But before we get to the nitty-gritty, we need to rewind a bit, right?
Yeah.
Back to Lenin.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
To understand Stalin, you have to understand the forces that shaped him. Think World War I. Empires crumbling like stale bread, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans, Russia. That kind of chaos creates a vacuum.
Right.
And vacuums are ripe for someone to seize power.
And enter Lenin and his Bolsheviks. They saw their chance and took it, leading the world's first successful communist revolution in 1917. Talk about a turning point in history.
It was the birth of the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, in 1922 with Lenin at the helm.
Yeah.
Imagine the political spectrum as a line. Communism sits way over on the left, advocating for total state control of the economy, aiming for a classless society.
Yeah.
That's where the USSR landed.
So we've got this brand new communist state, a massive experiment, really, with Lenin leading the charge. But then 1924, he dies.
Yeah.
And he didn't exactly leave a, in case of my death, here's the plan memo.
Right. Can you imagine the uncertainty, the jockeying for position?
Oh, yeah.
That kind of power vacuum is tailor-made for someone like Stalin to rise to the top. By 1928, he was the undisputed leader. But here's the thing. The USSR went from a one-party state under Lenin to essentially a one-man show under Stalin.
Okay, so how did he manage that? From what I gathered in these sources, Stalin wasn't afraid to play dirty.
Understatement. He was ruthless in purging anyone he saw as competition within the Communist Party. And it wasn't just political rivals. Stalin was deeply paranoid. He genuinely believed that the USSR was surrounded by enemies, capitalist countries just waiting for a chance to pounce.
Enemies on the outside, enemies on the inside.
Exactly.
This guy sounds exhausting. What was his grand plan to secure his power and, in his mind, protect the USSR?
Rapid industrialization. He was obsessed with turning the USSR into a modern powerhouse, capable of defending itself against all those perceived threats. His tool of choice, the infamous five-year plans.
Oh, yes, the 5-year plan. Even I remember those from history class.
Right.
They always sounded incredibly ambitious, almost impossibly so.
They were central to his whole economic strategy. The first one, running from 1928 to 1933, was laser-focused on heavy industries. Steel, coal, oil, the building blocks of a modern military and a strong economy. The second five-year plan, from 1933 to 1938, was supposed to shift toward producing more consumer goods, things that would actually improve people's daily lives.
Yeah.
But guess what?
What?
Heavy industry remained the priority.
So basically, make the USSR strong, whatever it takes. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, right?
Exactly. Stalin had his priorities, and he wasn't afraid to make sacrifices to achieve them. The sources highlight 6 key areas he targeted for rapid growth.
Okay.
First up, increasing machinery production. That was crucial for both farming and construction. 2 sectors he was determined to revolutionize.
More machinery does sound efficient, at least on paper.
Right.
What else was on the to-do list?
Next was boosting coal production. Coal was the lifeblood of industrialization, powering factories, generating electricity.
Mm-hmm.
And third, ramping up steel production. Vital for machinery, for building infrastructure, and of course for weapons.
Okay, so those 3, machinery, coal, steel, formed the industrial backbone of his plan.
Exactly.
That about the other 3.
Well, the fourth priority was oil, absolutely essential for running those factories and powering vehicles. The fifth one was a bit more, let's call it strategic.
Okay.
It involved taking advantage of Ukraine's incredible agricultural capacity. It was known as the breadbasket of Europe, and Stalin wanted to use that to his advantage.
So using it to feed the people?
Not quite. He wanted to use Ukraine to produce massive amounts of grain for export to sell on the global market.
Ah, so it was about bringing in money to fund his industrial ambitions.
Exactly.
Ruthless.
It was a calculated move. And that brings us to the sixth and final priority, perhaps the most brutal of them all, collectivization.
Okay, here's where things get really interesting and more than a little disturbing.
Right.
Collectivization, it almost sounds like a friendly community garden project,
Right.
but it was anything but.
You said it. It meant seizing privately owned farms and forcing people to work on massive state-controlled farms.
Wait, so basically stealing people's land and livelihood?
Essentially, yeah.
What was the justification for that?
Stalin believed, at least on paper, that this would lead to greater efficiency, especially with all the new machinery being churned out. But it was also about eliminating a group he perceived as a major threat, the kulaks.
The kulaks, weren't those the relatively well-off peasant farmers?
Yes.
So the middle class of the rural countryside?
You got it. Stalin saw them as capitalists, a direct threat to his communist vision. He considered them roadblocks to his collectivization scheme. So he decided to eliminate them.
Eliminate. That's a chilling word.
Yeah.
What did that look like in reality?
It was brutal. Stalin unleashed the NKVD, his secret police force, on them.
Wow.
Kulaks were arrested, exiled to Siberia, or worse, millions were ripped from their homes and land.
And what happened to food production when you disrupt the lives of farmers on that scale? It's hard to imagine there weren't severe consequences.
The consequences were devastating. Collectivization, coupled with grain seizures, directly led to a horrific famine in Ukraine in the 1930s. Millions starved to death. It's a tragic example of how ideological pursuits, even those framed as progress, can have horrific, unintended consequences.
It's mind-blowing how easily good intentions, or at least what's presented as good intentions, can be twisted into something so horrific.
Yeah.
So we're seeing this pattern with Stalin, right?
Right.
Modernization at any cost.
Absolutely. And tragically, it only gets darker from there.
Oh, no.
Between 1934 and 1938, the USSR descended into a period known as the Great Terror.
The Great Terror.
Yeah.
The name itself just sends chills down your spine.
It's ominous.
This was peak Stalin paranoia, wasn't it?
It was fueled by a deep-seated suspicion of anyone who might even think about opposing him.
Mm-hmm.
Stalin wielded the NKVD like a weapon to purge all potential enemies, real or imagined.
Wow.
This wasn't just about eliminating rivals anymore. This was about terrorizing the entire population into submission.
So who was caught in this web of paranoia? Who became a target?
It's a chilling list.
Yeah.
Anyone Stalin considered a threat was fair game.
Yeah.
Members of his own Communist Party, religious figures,
Wow.
anyone associated with the old bourgeois class, even remnants of the monarchy.
Wow. No one was safe.
No one was safe.
What was the fate? What was the fate of those who were accused?
Many were sent to the gulags, this vast and brutal network of forced labor camps scattered across the unforgiving expanse of the USSR, mostly in Siberia.
The gulags, just the name, you know?
I know.
Just conjures up images of suffering and despair. What
Yeah.
were conditions actually like in these camps?
Inhumane. Prisoners were forced to work in horrific conditions, often on massive infrastructure projects, dams, canals, railways.
Yeah.
It was backbreaking labor. Millions died from starvation, disease, overwork, or simply the brutality of the Siberian climate.
God, it's just sickening.
Yeah.
So not only was Stalin purging anyone he perceived as a threat, but he was also exploiting those he imprisoned
Yeah.
as slave labor to fuel his industrial ambitions.
It was a terrifying system of control, and underpinning it all was fear. The Great Terror created an atmosphere of suspicion and self-censorship.
Right.
People were terrified to speak their minds, to even whisper doubts for fear of being denounced as an enemy of the state.
Living under that kind of pressure, that constant threat, it's almost unimaginable.
Yeah.
So how did Stalin cultivate this culture of fear? How did he convince people to buy into it?
That's where the final piece of the puzzle falls into place.
Right.
And it's not just about brute force, it's about manipulation.
Okay.
This is where we see the power of propaganda and the cult of personality.
So it wasn't enough to control people through force, he had to control their minds too.
Exactly. Stalin was a master of propaganda.
Wow.
He understood the power of shaping public perception. He crafted this image of himself as the benevolent father of the nation. He was portrayed as this wise, almost godlike leader guiding the USSR toward a utopian future.
It's the classic dictator playbook, right?
Yes.
Create this larger-than-life persona to be both revered and feared.
Absolutely.
But did people actually buy into it?
Yeah.
It's hard to fathom how anyone could reconcile this glowing image
Right.
with the brutal reality of his regime.
That's the power of propaganda, especially when you control all the information.
Right.
Remember, there was no free press, no dissent allowed.
Right.
Stalin's version of history was the only version, and any evidence to the contrary was systematically erased.
We see that in the sources that we're looking at.
Yeah.
Those doctored photographs are a prime example.
Absolutely.
It's chilling to see how his political opponents were literally airbrushed out of official photos,
Yeah.
erased from history, like Trotsky, for example, a key figure in the early Bolshevik movement.
Right.
He just vanishes from Soviet records.
It's like he never existed.
Yeah.
History itself became a tool of propaganda.
Wow. And education played a massive role in this indoctrination campaign, right?
Huge.
From a very young age, children were taught to revere Stalin and embrace communist ideology as the only truth.
Right, from the moment they entered school.
Wow, so you have generation after generation growing up knowing nothing else.
Exactly.
It's incredibly effective,
It is.
but a terrifying strategy for ensuring compliance.
Yes, it's indoctrination on a mass scale.
You mentioned control over information.
Yeah.
How did Stalin silence dissenting voices and maintain that control?
He rigged the legal system to crush any opposition. There were no real elections. Only Communist Party members had any say in politics and individual rights. Non-existent.
Wow.
Instead, you had these show trials.
Those were just for show, right?
Exactly.
Purely for propaganda purposes.
They were meticulously staged events, carefully choreographed to publicly humiliate and condemn anyone deemed an enemy, often based on fabricated charges and forced confessions extracted through torture.
It's a tactic that's still sadly relevant today.
It is. It's a chilling thought.
In some parts of the world,
Absolutely.
it's almost inconceivable that children as young as 12 could be executed under Stalin's rule.
I know. It's horrifying.
That's just a complete disregard.
Complete disregard.
That for any kind of justice or basic human rights.
It highlights just how twisted the legal system was under Stalin's rule.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that he introduced a constitution in 1936.
Okay.
On paper, it promised basic rights like freedom of speech and assembly.
Right.
Of course, in reality, those rights were completely meaningless.
Yeah.
Just another tool in his propaganda machine designed to project an image of legitimacy to the outside world.
So to an outsider, Stalin's USSR might have looked like a nation undergoing rapid modernization,
Right.
maybe even a progressive force.
Right on the surface.
But beneath the surface, it was a regime built on terror,
On a foundation of fear.
control, and the systematic crushing of individual liberty.
It's a chilling paradox.
It is, and that raises an important question.
It does.
How should we view the legacy of Stalin's rule?
How do you weigh the good against the bad?
Because it's complex, right?
Incredibly complex.
On one hand, he did accomplish certain things.
He did.
He achieved his goal of rapid industrialization. The USSR went from a largely agrarian society to a major industrial and military power in just a few decades.
Remarkable transformation.
Our sources even show that industrial production had rebounded to pre-World War I levels by 1928.
It's astonishing.
That's a remarkable feat.
It is. It speaks to a certain kind of ruthless efficiency.
Right, and it wasn't just industry.
No.
The USSR made significant strides in science and technology.
Absolutely.
Education and infrastructure under Stalin on a purely material level, progress was undeniable.
There's no denying that.
But then we have to look at the other side of the coin, and it's a dark side, to say the least. What about the human cost of all of this so-called progress?
That's the part of the story that's often overlooked or downplayed. Stalin's policies resulted in an estimated 15 to 20 million deaths.
God.
Executions, famine, forced labor, exile. The numbers are just staggering.
Yeah.
It's a level of human suffering that's almost beyond comprehension.
It really makes you question how we measure progress, doesn't it?
It does.
How do you balance tangible achievements, you know?
Right.
Buildings, factories, scientific advancements against the immeasurable suffering of millions.
It's a question that historians and political scientists still grapple with today. It's the debate around Stalin's legacy. Was he a ruthless dictator who sacrificed millions of lives on the altar of his own ambition? Or was he, as some argue, a brutal but necessary force in transforming the USSR into a modern power, capable of withstanding its enemies?
It's not an easy question to answer.
No, it's not.
It's very hard to wrap your head around that level of complexity, that kind of moral ambiguity.
Absolutely.
But I think it's a conversation we need to have.
We do. And it's exactly why understanding history is so crucial. We can't sanitize the past or shy away from its ugliness. By studying figures like Stalin, by confronting the harsh realities of his rule, we arm ourselves with a deeper understanding of how power operates and the very real dangers of unchecked authority.
So what can we learn from all of this? If we had to distill Stalin's Russia down to a few key takeaways, what would they be?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is the importance of vigilance. Totalitarian regimes, even those disguised as forces for progress, they depend on silence. They depend on the suppression of dissent.
So speaking up matters. Questioning authority matters. Holding on to our freedoms, cherishing them, fighting for them, that's how we prevent history from repeating itself.
Exactly. And never underestimate the power of critical thinking. Don't just accept information at face value, especially when it comes from those in positions of power. Dig deeper. Ask questions. Challenge assumptions.
You're reminding me of that famous quote, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. It's a bit cliche, maybe,
Sure.
but it's true.
It's a cliche for a reason, because it's a fundamental truth about the human condition. We're a species prone to repeating the same mistakes, often to disastrous results. And it's only through understanding the past, learning from its tragedies and its triumphs, that we can hope to create a better future.
So how does Stalin's Russia, this case study in totalitarianism, how does that connect to us today in the 21st century?
Yeah.
It can seem like a lifetime ago, a world away.
It might seem distant, but the echoes of that era are still very much with us. The tactics used by totalitarian regimes, control of information, suppression of dissent, the creation of enemies to
Yeah.
unify the population, these are tactics that are sadly still employed by authoritarian regimes around the world.
It's like a playbook that gets dusted off and used again and again and again.
Over and over again, yeah.
So how do we even begin to recognize the warning signs? What should we be on the lookout for?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's not always easy. Totalitarian regimes are often very good at disguising their true nature, at least initially. They often come to power, promising unity, progress, or return to greatness.
It's a seductive narrative,
It is.
especially in times of uncertainty or fear.
Absolutely. So we need to be wary of leaders who demonize entire groups of people, who portray themselves as the sole saviors of the nation, who dismiss criticism as disloyalty or even treason.
It's about being aware of the subtle ways in which language can be used to manipulate and control.
Precisely. And we need to be critical consumers of information. In today's world, with the rise of social media and the constant bombardment of information, it's easier than ever to be swept up in propaganda and misinformation.
So checking your sources, looking for multiple perspectives, being willing to question what you see and hear, that's more important now than ever.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to have those uncomfortable conversations, to challenge your own biases, to engage with people who hold different viewpoints.
It's about being willing to have your worldview challenged, to potentially even change your mind.
Exactly. Because a mind that's closed off to new information, to different perspectives, that's a mind that's vulnerable to manipulation.
So critical thinking, open dialogue, and a healthy dose of skepticism, those are our weapons against the allure of authoritarianism.
I couldn't have said it better myself. We can't afford to be complacent. The fight for freedom, for individual rights, for a just and equitable society, it's an ongoing battle, one that requires constant vigilance and active participation.
It's a heavy responsibility, but it's one we all share.
It is. And it's a responsibility we can't afford to shirk. Because the alternative, a world where individual liberty is crushed under the weight of tyranny, that's not a world any of us want to live in.
You're right, it's a sobering thought, but an important one. We've covered a lot of ground here today. We've delved into the heart of a totalitarian regime, explored its inner workings, and confronted the devastating human cost of its ideology. It's heavy stuff, no doubt about it. But this is why history matters. It's not just about memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding the patterns of human behavior, the forces that shape our world, and the very real dangers of unchecked power.
It's about connecting the dots between the past and the present. Because the reality is, Stalin's Russia might seem like a distant chapter in a history book, but its legacy, the lessons we can learn from it, they're still incredibly relevant today.
Absolutely. We're talking about a regime that was built on a foundation of fear, propaganda, and the systematic crushing of individual rights. These are themes that unfortunately haven't disappeared from the world stage.
Not at all. We still see these tactics employed today, in varying degrees, by authoritarian regimes across the globe. It's a stark reminder that the fight for freedom, for human rights, it's a continuous struggle.
So what's the answer? How do we as individuals, as citizens, how do we guard against these forces? How do we prevent history from repeating itself in the most tragic ways possible?
That's the question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer, no magic formula. But I think it starts with awareness.
Hmm.
We need to be aware of the tactics used by authoritarian regimes, the subtle and not so subtle ways in which they operate. We need to be aware of how propaganda works, how it preys on our fears and our biases.
It's about being critical thinkers, right? Not just accepting information at face value, but questioning, digging deeper, looking for multiple perspectives.
Exactly. Don't just scroll through your social media feeds and assume that everything you see is true. Question your sources. Be wary of information that confirms your existing biases. Seek out different viewpoints, especially if they make you uncomfortable.
It's about being willing to have your worldview challenged. Because if you're never challenged, if you're never forced to confront opposing viewpoints, then you're more susceptible to manipulation.
Precisely. And it's not just about consuming information critically, it's also about engaging in civil discourse, even and maybe especially with people you disagree with. We need to remember that we can disagree with each other without resorting to demonization or hatred.
It's about finding that common ground, that shared humanity, even in the midst of disagreements.
Because ultimately, we're all in this together. The fight for a more just and equitable world, for a world where individual rights are respected and protected, it's a fight that requires all of us to be engaged, informed, and active participants.
It's a fight that requires us to learn from the mistakes of the past, to recognize the warning signs of tyranny, and to stand up for our values, even when it's difficult.
Because silence, apathy, those are the breeding grounds for oppression. It's when we become complacent, when we take our freedoms for granted, that we're most vulnerable to those who would seek to take them away.
So this deep dive into Stalin's Russia, it's not just a history lesson, it's a call to action.
It is. It's a reminder that freedom is a precious and fragile thing, and it requires constant vigilance and active participation to safeguard it for ourselves and for future generations.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into this dark and complex chapter of history. Remember, the past isn't just something we study, it's something we learn from, something that shapes who we are and who we can become.
So keep questioning, keep learning, and keep engaging with the world around you.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep diving deep.